Good afternoon. It's an honor for me to be able to present at the 6th Alain Ramon Conference, and I would like to thank General Agmon and Tal Inbar of the Institute and Dayanet Pakowski of the Tel Aviv University for all that they've done to facilitate the visit to Israel, which is my first visit to Israel. So I'm looking forward also to touring the country a little after this conference is over. Now, the talk that I'm giving today, I think, may be useful in providing a context for Mr. Augustyn's lecture, which is on current and future U.S. human spaceflight policy. And I'm going to give you a little tour of some earlier policy or attempts to have a policy for human spaceflight in the United States, influenced by the character that I've written about, Wernher von Braun, in the biography that I published 3 years ago. And this talk specifically addresses something that has been called the von Braun paradigm. Now, the von Braun paradigm is a term that was actually coined by a colleague of ours in Washington, D.C. He's now at the Space Studies Board of the National Academy of Sciences, Dwayne Day. 1994-95, he coined the term in response to the failure of the Space Exploration Initiative of 1989, which I will explain more about when I get to that point of the lecture. But this was the attempt of the first President Bush to send a new policy for going back to the moon, going back to Mars. And Day's comment was that all of this plan was fundamentally going back to the same plan that Wernher von Braun laid out in the 1950s, that it had 4 fundamental elements, that we have a space shuttle, a space station, then we go to the moon, and then we go to Mars, in that order, as he laid out this concept, and that it went back to the 1950s. This concept has been developed further by my colleague in the museum, Roger Launius, who actually spoke at this conference last year. And he has proposed that it actually had more than 4 stages and other various details that won't concern us really here, since I'm talking more about the policy part than the history part of the story. But this concept has been employed by space historians, and it was when I set out to do this lecture, my fundamental purpose was to understand, has this thing, the von Braun paradigm, actually worked? Did it exist, and what was it made up of, and how much influence did it actually have? Can you actually prove that this was a determining influence on the way the U.S. tried to go into space? Now, of course, it's actually essentially my story that the United States human space policy has never adhered to von Braun's paradigm, but that it has been influential at times over how the United States tried to have its space program, its human space program. Now, to go back to the beginning, Wernher von Braun, as you may know, had been working for Nazi Germany as the chief engineer of the V-2 ballistic missile program, was brought over to the United States very quickly after the end of the war, as the United States scooped up a team of about 125 Germans to start working on American ballistic missile programs and other missile programs in the late 1940s, and of course in the process sweeping under the rug many of the scandals that had taken place in Nazi Germany, including concentration camp labor. Well, von Braun was employed at first when he reached the United States in El Paso, Texas, on the Mexican border at Fort Bliss for the U.S. Army. There was no NASA. NASA was not even created until 1958, after Sputnik. And in his spare time, since budgets were cut back and money was not available for an ambitious rocket program, he had spare time on his hands, and he decided he was going to try to sell the United States people on a space program. In the late 1940s, the space program was just a dream of the future. There was no space program except launching V-2s into the upper atmosphere to gain a little bit of knowledge. This obsession with space goes back to the childhood. In the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, it was the first flourishing of space travel ideas in the world, particularly in the Soviet Union, in German-speaking Central Europe and the United States. these were the areas where space dreaming certainly started, and the first theorists like Obert, Tsiolkovsky, and Goddard first wrote books and published books. So he was obsessed with the idea of going into space. He was obsessed with the idea of going to the moon. In fact, as I discovered in the process of writing the book, he really felt that he wanted to lead an expedition to the moon. He wanted to land on the moon himself, that he was seized by this ambition that led him into a Faustian bargain with the Third Reich. But it's really a story for another day. And so as he began thinking about how to sell the American people on space travel in the 1940s, he decided he would write a science fiction novel. It was going to be a science fiction novel about how to go to Mars. And his ambition was to lay out the feasibility of sending humans to Mars, figuring if you could prove that that was feasible based on the extrapolation of technologies in the 40s, you could prove to people that space travel was not just science fiction, not just Buck Rogers fantasy, but it could actually come about. And so he sat down to write a feasibility study, which is like a mathematical treatise that he wrote about his imagining a trip to Mars, and then he wrote a novel called Mars Project on this idea of sending humans to Mars and the first landing of humans on Mars. Well, the novel was terrible. I mean, von Braun was incredibly talented. He was a great musician. He had many, many abilities, but novel writing was not one of them. And so the novel never got published until actually just a few years ago. A small Canadian publisher issued it. But basically no one would publish them. No New York publisher would take the novel. And so the mathematical appendix was published in 1952-53 as The Mars Project, which you can still buy in German and English. And the Mars Project was this mathematical study that laid out, as I mentioned in the bottom part of the slide, the basic foundation for his ideas, that you would have a winged space shuttle, that you would have a space station shaped like a wheel, and that you would use that infrastructure in low Earth orbit to go to the moon, go to Mars. The real breakthrough that he had in space advocacy took place in the 1950s. And that's when Collier's magazine, which was an influential magazine for the general public, this is a cover of the very last one of these issues. There were 8 issues of Collier's magazine advocating space travel were published between March 1952 and April 1954. These were illustrated with beautiful paintings by Chesley Bonestell and 2 other artists, and kind of had laid out this vision for space travel, for the future of going to the Earth, going to the space station, going to the moon, going to Mars, in various issues in these things. And I think the space historians have rated these as really important in terms of trying to establish the credibility. It's interesting that we're only, at the beginning of this series, only 5 years before Sputnik, but as far as many people were concerned, space travel was still a remote and utopian idea. And so in this series, von Braun lays out this central infrastructure that he thought necessary to go into space. I mentioned in the bottom here, of course, that it's interesting that there's almost no anticipation of robotic space travel, unmanned satellites. In this early generation of space advocacy, humans going was the whole point. And unmanned space travel was really not even considered very much. And partly it was due to the electronics being very primitive, and the computers were lacking, and people could not, even the advocates could not imagine the sort of computerized electronics, unmanned spacecraft we have. But also it was simply because they were obsessed with the idea of human exploration, and for them, sending humans was the point. And so, I think at the end of this series, von Braun had laid out this program for the United States and for for what he thought was human spaceflight for anybody, that this was the logical way to go. You would build your winged space shuttle to take things into orbit, you would construct a space station, and then you would go on to the moon and to Mars. This was actually reinforced in the 1950s, right after that. As a result of the Collier series, von Braun received an invitation from Walt Disney's company, who was just starting a new television series for American television, very famous at the time. I grew up with this in Canada, with Walt Disney every Sunday night on TV for children, for families. And as part of this new TV series, they decided to do programs about space travel. And these programs were broadcast in 1955, and the last one was broadcast in December 1957 on Mars, just after Sputnik. But particularly important were the first couple of shows about building the space station, going into space, and going to the moon. And again, legitimizing space travel is not a crazy idea. Legitimizing the idea of human travel being the whole point of it, and reinforcing this apparently logical program of shuttle station, moon, and Mars. And so in my analysis of this, again, the details are not important so much for this audience, but my conclusion was that indeed Dwayne Day's definition essentially was true. Now, it's interesting that as soon as the space race came along, von Braun was the first person who was willing to overthrow his whole apparently logical way to go into space and rush into going to the moon anyway, because he was really, as I've mentioned, really fascinated by the idea of moon travel, of landing on the moon. He'd hoped to travel to the moon himself. Space travel did not develop fast enough to ever make that a feasible possibility. But he had repeatedly talked about a moon expedition during his lifetime, going back to the 1920s. And he talked about it two ways. One is, you assemble things in orbit, maybe by the space station, maybe not. That's what they call in the Apollo era Earth orbit rendezvous. Or would you go direct? Would you send a rocket directly to the moon and land on the moon? And in fact, it was this second idea that he published a short. He did have a success in publishing a short science fiction novella in 1959 called First Men to the Moon. Or maybe it came out in the end of 58 as a magazine series, and in 59 as a book. First Men to the Moon actually just talks about launching two guys directly to the moon, one rocket, and that rocket lands on the moon and comes back. And obviously, they still thought that if you came back to Earth, you should have wings on your spacecraft. It's taken that as a fundamental idea. I find that, again, interesting because although a lot of people have taken this so-called von Braun paradigm as a gospel, this is the way von Braun said we should go into space, von Braun himself was quite willing to think about it in a completely different way. Now, as a result of Sputnik, as a result of the space race starting, of course, suddenly the United States was throwing money at space travel. Human space travel then came on the agenda. Obviously, we were in a race with the Soviet Union. We had to get a human into space quickly. And so, instead of a winged space shuttle, the first spacecraft were capsules, because that was the quick way to get into space and not to build something complicated like a space plane. At any rate, von Braun advocated another plan in 1958 to 1960 when he was just transitioning from the Army to the new NASA that was formed in 58 for using his new Saturn booster that had been funded after Sputnik to build a bigger booster to launch many pieces into space, assemble them in Earth orbit, and go to the moon, ultimately to construct a moon base. This was the objective. Now, of course, what happened in the early 60s was that we went to the moon via Apollo, which was very much not in line with with von Braun's paradigm. This was a specific decision of the Kennedy administration. Eisenhower, who had been the president until the beginning of 61, was very skeptical of a big human space program. He didn't want to put money into it. He did it very reluctantly, and he thought going to the moon was crazy. It was a big waste of money. Kennedy came into office and was immediately faced with a number of challenges. One of them was that on the 50 years ago, this April the 12th, Yuri Gagarin, as General Agmon mentioned, went into orbit. And right after Yuri Gagarin went into orbit, the United States had a humiliating defeat of the Cuban exiles who landed at the Bay of Pigs and tried to overthrow Castro. So right within 1 week, there were two kind of embarrassing political events, and Kennedy became convinced he was already thinking that way, and these two events kind of precipitated a discussion inside the Kennedy administration. What are we going to do now to show the Soviets that we can keep up? Because they were getting all the first. They were winning all the early space flight prizes. And so out of this came the Apollo program, and that meant overthrowing any kind of plan to build a space plane, space station, and going directly to the moon. And interestingly, again, von Braun, whatever his earlier plans, whatever his paradigm he had laid out so carefully as the logical way to go to the moon, he said, oh, great, and jumped on board that with enthusiasm. His center became the booster center for Apollo program. The Saturn V, you see this gigantic Saturn V being wheeled out of the assembly building, over 100 meters tall in 1966. This is von Braun on the left, and on the right is the head of the human space program after 1963, George Miller. He jumped on board, and he accepted the fact that the so-called lunar orbit rendezvous method, where you had a small lander to go down, was the logical way to solve this problem in a hurry. Now, one of the effects of Apollo was to foreclose any real discussion of what else we could do, because Apollo was so expensive, there was no money for a human space program beyond Apollo except on paper. The first objective was to get to the moon, land on the moon. That was a $20 billion program in 1960s dollars, and all other planning kind of was pushed to the side. There was some planning to have a space station, to build the wheel that von Braun had advocated so much, a rotating wheel space station where you create artificial gravity. But that was all pretty much shelved by the mid-60s in favor of short-term programs to use Apollo hardware. So what was later called Skylab, to build a temporary space station using Apollo hardware, was one of the things that came out of Apollo hardware. And any systematic planning went to the wayside. Beyond that, in the later 60s, von Braun and Miller started to begin advocating the space shuttle, the idea that we'd have a winged space plane. And that was the logical transportation system we needed to get back into space. So after Apollo, we needed to go back from this rush program and try to go back to a systematic planning. Now, this came to a head in 1969. With the landing on the moon, almost successfully achieved. It was a few months beforehand. The new President Nixon, who came into office in January '69, said, we need a plan for post-Apollo. What are we going to do with human space travel after that? And he created a space task group, and the two of the leading figures here are on the picture. In the middle is Tom Paine, who was the NASA administrator at the time, and on the right, Vice President Spiro Agnew, and a couple of other leading personalities in the U.S. government formed this group. Von Braun was still in Huntsville with the Marshall Space Flight Center, had a lot of personal direct influence. And what I think is very interesting about this story is how much they came back to the von Braun paradigm. When they said, what should the future of the human program should be? It should be building a shuttle, building a space station. Then we use that infrastructure to go back to the moon and go to Mars. In fact, just before Apollo, George Miller had developed a so-called integrated space program plan, which is for a transportation system, both to Earth orbit with a shuttle, with a nuclear engine that would go shuttle things back and forth from Earth orbit to the moon and back. And Paine went to von Braun and said, we need a Mars plan. We want to present landing humans on Mars after Apollo. After we've succeeded in landing on the moon, we've got to go to the president and go to the Congress and say, we need to land on Mars. That's the next major thing that we went to do. And in fact, that became the centerpiece for presenting the post-Apollo plan when the Space Task Group presented its plan in the fall of 1969. And going to Mars was as politically disastrous, I think, for this plan as anything else, because the public was not in the mood for a new, incredibly expensive space program. You have to remember the historical context of this time was Vietnam, riots, urban problems, growing concern about air pollution, water pollution, and people said, well, we proved our point. We beat the Russians to the moon. Why do we keep spending billions on going to the moon? Why do we want to go to Mars now? So, a minority of the public was enthused by the space enthusiast public was enthused by going to Mars, but nobody else was, and it was a political failure. And it pretty much dragged down this whole systematic plan, except for the one element that survived was the shuttle. And as I mentioned here on this slide, effectively, the NASA budget was cut in half from the mid-60s to the mid-70s. In purchasing power, maybe even more than half, given how high inflation was in those years. And so NASA did not have money for an ambitious space program except for the shuttle, and sold the shuttle as a program for that would be economical, that you could launch a lot and you could make money from it. And so the shuttle became the only thing that was approved out of that plan in 1972 by Nixon and by Congress. And in many ways, it became an end of itself. Now, the next time this kind of idea of space, the von Braun paradigm, came back was 20 years later in 1989. In the meantime, von Braun had died, and as I note here in passing, the controversy over his Nazi past, over concentration camp labor, the fact that, as was found out after 1984, that he had been an SS officer, came back to haunt him, and I kind of wonder if his name became less popular, although I can't actually prove that connection. There are many other discussions in the 70s and 80s about alternate plans. Gerard O'Neill outlined plans for space colonies in libration points near the moon. There were discussions going to the asteroids and comets. However, in many ways, again, NASA and the political leadership of the United States said we need to go back to the script. And so in 1983, Reagan approved the building of a space station. It was originally, of course, a U.S. station with U.S. allies, and only became the International Space Station in the 1990s under Clinton when the Soviet Union collapsed. But that was the beginning of the space station program, which has essentially always been stage 2 of the von Braun plan. In 1986 came the Challenger accident, the first shuttle accident. Many reports about what the United States should do. What is the future of American space planning? None of those reports seem to have yielded anything very solid. And in 1989, Reagan's term was finished, second term was finished. George Bush, H.W. Bush the elder, came in as president at the beginning of 1989. And he went to NASA and said, what is your vision for going into space? What is your vision for the future of human exploration? He gave his speech actually on the steps of our museum at the Air and Space Museum here. You can see a picture, a blurry picture, best I could get on this. On July the 4th, 1989, or actually it says July the 20th, 1989. It was the 20th anniversary of the moon landing. He endorses, again, effectively this plan: space shuttle, space station, moon, and Mars. And once again, that plan became a subject of controversy and was rejected by the public and by Congress because the best estimates that NASA came up with were $400 billion at least for going to Mars. Mars always being kind of the symbol of this ultimately ambitious program. So, what happened after that? Basically, of course, we were still with the space shuttle, and the space shuttle has gone on, and only now is going to be retired after 30 years of service. So we had the space shuttle and building the space station, already two very expensive programs, which kind of foreclosed other options. And it really wasn't until the beginning of this last decade where once again the United States political establishment and NASA began talking about what the future of human spaceflight should be, and that led to something called the Decadal Planning Team, which was internal planning in NASA. But it really didn't come to a head until the Columbia accident, which very unfortunately killed the 7 astronauts, including Alain Ramon. The anniversary, of course, is tomorrow. In 2003. After the Columbia accident, once again, the discussion was, what do we do? What should the future of human spaceflight for the United States be? Should it just be simply to keep going around in low Earth orbit? No human has been farther than 400 miles from the Earth since 1972. So should we always be in low Earth orbit? Should the space station be an end in itself, sort of like the space shuttle became? And so this led to something called the Vision for Space Exploration, which was NASA's plan presented to George W. Bush, the younger, in 2004 and 2005. Bush George W. Bush went to NASA headquarters, gave this speech about how we need to go back to the moon, how we need to go back to Mars. That took place at the end of 2004. And interestingly enough is how that all has again played out to be less than what was hoped for. In 2005, under the new NASA administrator, Griffin, the planning then went forward for a Constellation. Constellation became, very quickly in the planning in 2005 and after, a moon program. Because I think the basic political reality was landing men on, or humans and women on Mars is going to be incredibly expensive. It requires a lot of development. And unless we have deep space voyaging experience, again, we can't really go back to Mars, so maybe we better practice by going back to the moon first. And so it really became a moon program with the Mars thing way off in the distant future. There were people who have and still are advocating, instead of a very expensive program for landing on the moon and building a moon base, we go to the asteroids, which are relatively accessible. They have very low gravitational fields. You can land on them easily. And that idea has certainly come back to us. Of course, at the end of this process brings us right up to today. In the last couple of years, and Mr. Augustine will give us a much more expert account of what has happened and what is going to happen with these programs. But clearly, Constellation failed. Politically, because it was underfunded by the Bush administration. The analysis was that it was going to take far too long to land on the moon under the existing funding, and that it was an unsustainable course. And the Obama administration, thanks in part to the Augustine report, has decided that to cancel the moon landing, cancel going back to the moon for the foreseeable future, and is talking about an asteroid mission as an alternative. And so as far as the von Braun paradigm is concerned, it appears really to be in decline or dead now. That doesn't mean it can't be revived sometime in the future. It certainly may have a future. As I indicate here, my conclusion from my historical study is that the von Braun paradigm really does consist of those four elements, was very influential on U.S. plans for going into deep space with humans, but in fact has never actually come about because of the political cost, the cost to the economy of very, very ambitious human spaceflight programs. And with the cancellation of Constellation, and with thinking about going into other objectives for human spaceflight, like asteroid missions, and doing it in a different way, also ending the space shuttle program, and with the decision to build a capsule for the moon program, and which will, under Orion, presumably continue to exist, the space plane is no longer viewed with as much enthusiasm as it used to. We are probably going to go into humans in deep space a different way than von Braun really laid out. But he certainly had influence for 20 or 30 years over how the United States imagined it was going to go into space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And we would like to give you a small present.
Thank you.
Space of Israel.
Thank
you very, very much. Thank you very much. מאלף. את נורמן אגוסטין להציג זה לא כל כך קל, אז בחרתי כמה נקודות. נורמן אגוסטין גדל בקולורדו ולמד באוניברסיטת פרינסטון, שם סיים בהצטיינות לימודיו בהנדסה אירונאוטית גם בתואר ראשון וגם בתואר שני. ב-1958 הצטרף לחברת דוגלס איירקראפט קומפני, וב-1965 הצטרף למשרד ההגנה כאסיסטנט דירקטור of Defense Research and Engineering. ב-1975 הוא התמנה ל-Under Secretary of the Army, ויותר מאוחר התמנה לסקרטרי of the Army בפועל. הצטרף למרטין מריאטה ב-1977 מילא שם תפקידים לכל אורך השורה הבחירה, כולל לבסוף CEO ונשיא החברה. לאחר שמרטין מרייטה מוזגה עם לוקיד מרטין, התמנה אוגוסטין ל-CEO ויושב ראש חברת לוקיד מרטין. עם פרישתו התמנה כפרופסור באוניברסיטת פרינסטון. הוא פעיל במגוון מאוד רחב של פעילויות חברתיות וציבוריות, רשימה אינסופית שמתחילה כיושב ראש של הרד קרוס ויושב ראש הבוי סקאוטס הצופים, ועד יושב ראש איגוד התעשיות האירוספייס, יושב ראש איגוד הצבא האמריקאי ויושב ראש דירקטוריון המדע הביטחוני ועוד ועוד ועוד. שתי נקודות ציון בתחום החלל, כמו שקיבלנו כבר ברקע שציין פה מייקל. ב-1990 הוא הוביל את הוועדה לבחינת תוכנית החלל האמריקאית שנודעה בשם ועדת אוגוסטין, ועכשיו הוא מוביל לבקשת הנשיא אובמה את הוועדה לבחינת תוכנית הטיסות המאוישות לחלל של ארצות הברית. מעל הכל הוא ידוע ומפורסם בצורת החשיבה המאוד יצירתית שלו, מחוץ לקופסה מה שאנחנו קוראים. הוא כתב ספרים על כך, הספר שלו אוגוסטין לואוס הפך לבסט סלר, והישגיו מעידים על כך שחשיבה מחוץ לקופסה יכולה, זאת הדרך להביא להישגים בעולם שלנו כיום. ולבסוף נקודה ישראלית, יש אגדה שמתהלכת בתעשיות הישראליות ובקהילה הביטחונית, אבל האגדה הזאת היא סיפור אמיתי. בזמן שנורמן אוגוסטין היה מנכ"ל, מרטין מרייטה היה משא ומתן בין רפאל בראשות המנכ"ל מוסה פלד, זכרו לברכה, על נושא של לעשות עסקים ביחד. זה היה מהלך מאוד חשוב ואסטרטגי לגבי רפאל, והמהלך הוביל לנושא של משא ומתן לגבי ייצור משותף של הפופאי, אחד המערכות הלחימה המשוכללות של רפאל. ובסיכום של משא ומתן מאוד מסובך, המשא ומתן נחתם בלחיצת יד, בלי עורכי דין ובלי כל מה שאחרי זה השלימו את הניירת, בין מוסה פלד לנורמן אוגוסטין. זה לחיצת יד שהובילה את רפאל ומרטין מרייטה לעסקות במיליארד דולר לישראל, לארצות הברית, לדרום קוריאה ואוסטרליה, ואחרי זה נוספו לזה עוד עסקאות בתחום המערכות של האפאצ'י, מערכות של הלנטרין, ואחרי זה שנורמן עבר ללוקיד מרטין, אני לא צריך לספר על המשך העסקאות, כולם יודעים מה לוקיד עושה ושיתופי פעולה שהיא עושה עם תעשיית הביטחון הישראלי, כך שנורמן הוא ידיד ורע, ואנחנו מאוד מאוד שמחים שהוא מצא את הזמן לבוא פה עם מג אשתו ולהשכיל אותנו בניסיונו. אז נורמן, תודה רבה, בבקשה.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for that very generous introduction. It probably would have been shorter and more accurate just to have said that I'm an unemployed aerospace worker. As I listened, I was reminded of my first day on the faculty at Princeton University, where I was invited to give the welcoming lecture to the incoming freshman engineers. Up until that time, I'd spent my entire career either in government or in industry. And as the dean was making his remarks, I wasn't paying much attention to what he was saying. I was flipping through my lecture notes, and all of a sudden I heard him remark, and now we will hear from Professor Augustine. Now, this is absolutely true. For just about an instant of time, the thought went through my mind, gee, what a coincidence. They've got some guy here by the same name as me. So thank you for that very nice introduction. And I'm truly pleased to be back in Israel, where I have so many friends, friends that I've made over more decades than I guess I would like to confess to. and I always treasure the opportunity to be back in this remarkable country. One whom I, of course, will miss seeing is General Musa Peled, a great soldier, a businessman, a statesman, and a good friend. It was my privilege to have participated with Musa in putting together a number of business transactions, always based on a handshake. Yet on this day, of course, the person we have most in our memory is Ilan Ramon and the other brave astronauts who were colleagues of his on that tragic day in 2003. Sadly, as we all know, progress doesn't come without a price, and sometimes it is a terrible price. And it's been accurately noted that one cannot explore the distant horizons without leaving the harbor. Israel, of course, has been disproportionately blessed with individuals who understand the truth of that. And certainly the Fisher Institute has set, I think, a very inspiring example when it recognizes an individual of the stature of Ilan Ramon. And I'm honored to be able to play even a small part in this tribute to his memory. I've been asked to offer my perspective of the United States space program as it's likely to evolve in the coming decades. And I'm very pleased to do that. But I must ask you to understand that I speak today only as an individual private citizen of my country. My friend Lori Garver, the Deputy Administrator of NASA, from whom you heard yesterday, along with Administrator Charlie Bolden, are the people to whom we all look for leadership in America's civil space program. And needless to say, we're fortunate in our country to have people of their ability to take the positions that they hold. I need to confess that not long ago I was asked to speak on the space program to another very distinguished group. That was my grandson's preschool class of 5-year-olds. Now, that was a terrifying experience. Lecturing at Princeton is nothing compared to that. And I began by asking how many of these, there were about 30 young 5-year-olds sitting on the floor with me. I asked how many of them wanted to be astronauts. And every hand flew into the air. So then I asked them if anyone knew what astronauts did. And nobody moved a muscle. But I was prepared for this, and so I suggested that we call an astronaut on the telephone, put him on the speakerphone, and ask them what astronauts do. So we called Buzz Aldrin, whom I'd arranged to speak with on this topic. He was kind enough to take our call at 6 a.m. in his time zone. And Buzz did a terrific job of answering all the astronaut questions. And, you know, were you scared? What did you eat? How'd you go to the bathroom? The key things you want to know, I guess, if you want to be an astronaut. And Buzz was a big hit. I never did have the courage to tell him after that session, I still haven't told him, that it turned out that most of the kids thought they were talking to Buzz Lightyear. So don't anybody tell Buzz. Before discussing the future of human spaceflight or spaceflight in general, I think it's important to understand the past of spaceflight. And you've just heard a terrific description of the past of human spaceflight from the U.S. perspective. And what I'd like to do is just abbreviate a little bit of that and then look to the future. The one thing that stands out above all else in my mind in terms of lessons from the past is that space is a very unforgiving place. The space business, unlike the automobile business, we very seldom get recalls. One has to get it right the first time and every time, and that's particularly true in the human spaceflight program. And as we all know, otherwise we pay a terribly high price. When I try to project the next few decades in space, I think it's useful to keep in mind how briefly we have been involved in this business called space. Each of us in this room has had the extraordinary good fortune to have lived in this little sliver of time that's been called the space age. My friends who are astrophysicists tell me that that our universe has been around for about 13.7 billion years. My geologist friends tell me the Earth itself has been here about 4.5 billion years. And if you think about it, the Big Bang in the space program occurred in about 1957. I was just entering graduate school at the time. when Sputnik was launched. And it's also helpful to put this all in perspective to note that that the time from the Big Bang to the launch, the space program's Big Bang, if you will, to the time that Gagarin first flew is about equal to the time from Gagarin's flight to today. For perspective, that was about 54 years. Certainly anyone in that kind of an environment would have to be terribly audacious and perhaps even foolish to try to attempt to predict the future of spaceflight. So that's what I will now attempt to do. A little background. As I said, I entered graduate school when Sputnik was orbited. Actually, during the first couple of weeks I was at graduate school. That was the height of the Cold War, as you've heard. And then on that occasion, I could recall a Soviet commentator commenting that, of course, this followed the U-2 incidents where the U.S. was flying aircraft over the Soviet Union. The Soviet commentator made the point that the Sputnik had been placed in inertial orbit in the cosmos, and that if the United States happened to rotate under it, that was the U.S.'s problem. Sputnik, though, offered only a brief peek at the challenges, some of the perplexing problems that arise in the use of space and the exploration of space. So far, I think these issues have been generally rather well addressed, but they include questions like who, if anyone, owns a moon or an asteroid and the resources that may come with it, who has the right-of-way in geosynchronous orbit, who's responsible for the effects of human-created space debris, who's liable for damages here on Earth caused by re-entering spacecraft, should we ever attempt to divert an asteroid that was on a collision course, who would be responsible for the parts of those asteroids that did damage that otherwise might not have, and so on. In spite of all these questions, there have obviously been some very high points in the space program and also the low points. Certainly the lowest in America's part of the program were the Apollo fire, the Challenger, and the Columbia accidents. These were, I think, among the few events in a lifetime that one remembers where they were when they first heard about them, and that was certainly my case. But it was also America's President John Kennedy who reminded us when he announced that the nation was going to place humans on the moon and bring them back safely within the decade, that we do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And indeed they are. Shortly after the Challenger accident, there were two commissions established to look at separate aspects of the U.S. space program. One, of course, was led by the former Secretary of State. It was assigned to really try to determine the cause of the accident and derive the lessons to be learned from it. The other commission I was privileged to chair, and our task was to take a look at the overall space program in the U.S. The years ahead and make some recommendations as to what we might do. And I would note again that during that period of time, the space program had been largely driven by this competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The principal finding of the Rogers Commission was, of course, that the seals on the solid rocket motors that were believed to be redundant were in fact not redundant because they weren't independent. And that's a lesson that we've learned over and over as we have continued the space program. The review I led on behalf of the White House and NASA, we predicted that sadly we were likely to lose another space shuttle, and that was a projection that was based primarily on our disbelief of our technology in building reliability models for space systems. It's noteworthy, I think, that very few of the failures that we've encountered have even been included in the models we use to analyze reliability and safety. They're usually attributed to something that we didn't even think of, like a debonding of foam insulation, or leaky seals, or missing hyphens in software, or errors in converting English to metric units, so on. Our review also concluded that the U.S. needed to develop a heavy lift launch vehicle and to do that rather quickly if we wanted to have an affordable space program in the future. We also noted that we were underinvesting in technology, which at the time you're doing it isn't very attractive to anyone except the technologists. But by not investing in it, we said that we were going to place our future decision makers in a position where their menu of choices was going to be very narrow. But at the point we emphasized the most was that the U.S. had been trying for a number of years to conduct a space program whose objectives were not compatible with our willingness to fund those objectives. So we had one set of objectives and funding that applied to a different set of objectives, and we had indicated that that was a formula for disaster, particularly in an arena as unforgiving as space travel. Well, 2 years ago, when I was asked by the President to chair the review of the space program, the most recent review, that was exactly the message that we took away once again in the situation. And I wish I could say with some confidence that this won't happen again. But in my view, any future accomplishment of the U.S. space program, particularly the human spaceflight program, is going to depend far more on our willingness to match resources to goals than it is to by any of the technical challenges that we might encounter. This will require a great deal of discipline on the part of our political leadership, particularly our Congress. Now, a lot's changed since that initial study that kind of laid the basis for some of the things that have come up more recently. Today, the U.S. space program, interestingly, finds Russia as an indispensable partner in both our human spaceflight program and our civil space program, and certainly our commercial program. Indeed, for a number of years, the Russian launch systems will be the sole means for the U.S. astronauts to travel to and from the International Space Station. Certainly an indication, I think, of what we're going to see as more and more of an internationalization of space as time goes ahead, for very good reasons. One is that a lot of nations now have technology to offer, and also this will be a very expensive burden for any one nation if we were to even think about things like going to Mars with humans. In the purely technical arena, there have, of course, been enormous advances since the first study that I was involved in. High on that list would be the development of microelectronics and our knowledge of space operations. Regarding the former, I once asked one of the two inventors of the integrated circuit how many individual elements he thought one day we might be able to place on a single chip. And if I remember right, he said about 300. And as you know, today we speak of billions, with the cost of those elements having dropped commensurately. We've also learned that solid rocket motors that we all thought were so simple and so reliable in comparison with complex liquid motors are not so simple after all. We learned that launching spacecraft is a lot like doing heart surgery, that you better either do a lot of it or do none of it. And to our dismay, we found that software would quickly become so complex that we couldn't possibly test every possible path that it might contain. And for example, just to give an indication that applies not just to software but to hardware as well, if you take a system that has just 5 individual discrete elements, each connected with every other element by an outbound and an inbound path, just on or off on each of those paths, just binary. It turns out the number of states for that very simple system, if my arithmetic is right, is 1,073,741,824. That is a simple system. All this, I think, is very sobering when we look at the kind of complexity that's going to go into any future exploration system. Well, that all brings us to the circumstance today, a time when controversy pervades much of the world's space program, and certainly that of the United States. In the case of human spaceflight, the U.S. has found itself badly divided, even among those of us that have been its strongest proponents. Not long ago, I found myself in the very uncomfortable position of sitting beside my friend Neil Armstrong in front of a congressional committee with each of us testifying in exactly opposite directions as to where the human spaceflight program should go. Certainly, space exploration and utilization is an area that reasonable people can disagree about and certainly do. And one area that's proven particularly contentious in the U.S. has been the extent to which U.S. commercial firms should be involved in the transportation of particularly humans into orbit, to low Earth orbit, if you will. In my mind, one of the biggest limiters to the spaceflight program as a whole has been the rather modest gains that have been made in the cost per pound of putting payload in low Earth orbit. And when you measure such costs in thousands of dollars per pound, as we do today, merely to get to low Earth orbit, that's a huge impediment to the use of space, an impediment that I think is going to have to be solved. I'll come back to that. I became convinced that, as did the committee I served on, that NASA should focus on exploration beyond near-Earth orbit and should leave the trucking business to near-Earth orbit to the commercial sector, with, this is important, with NASA providing strong safety oversight, independent oversight, I should add. But I'll say that such a course impacts tens of thousands of existing jobs, and the political leadership of our country may not be prepared to address the kind of disruption that implies, particularly at this point in time from an economic standpoint. Let me turn just very briefly to the military use of space before I come back to the human spaceflight program, the next step, maybe the step beyond the next step even. It's kind of ironic, I think, that the high cost of accessing Earth orbit may prove to be a beneficial factor, at least for the more developed nations, when it comes to the military use of space. And one of the reasons for that is the high cost of hauling cargo into space, and the average group of terrorists is not going to be able to do that on their own. On the other hand, space really is the high ground in military operations of the future. And in fact, the day is likely to come when virtually all unconcealed and possibly even what's believed to be concealed will be monitored around the world from space in real time. In that regard, I'm reminded of a comment that was once made to me by Gene Fubini, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense of the U.S. Gene told me that there is no evidence of an enemy ever successfully using camouflage against us. Think about that for a moment, and that may raise the sort of issues we run into. And when one connects this ability to monitor objects on Earth in basically real time, when you connect that with a real-time targeting and a high-speed weapon delivery system, the character of combat does change markedly. Arnaud Dupic said some centuries ago that to fight from a distance is instinctive in man, and that seems to be equally true today when we have operators flying unmanned aircraft thousands of miles away. And I still come back to what's my personal belief, that in 21st century combat, just like first century combat, that in the end, with all this technology, it's going to come back to boots on the ground. And that the difference will be that this technology is going to make those individual soldiers much more effective than they were in the past. And that technology certainly includes space technology. Well, let me then turn back to the civil space program, which at least in the United States has two very closely related elements. The robotic program that's often associated with science, and the human space flight program that's often associated with exploration. And clearly these two undertakings do overlap and complement one another. For example, I think it's very doubtful that any robot could have made the repairs to the Hubble that were made by humans, at least as the Hubble had been designed. Similarly, the time delay in directing mobile robots on Mars is so long that it makes very simple operations extremely complex. But if one were to place a human on one of Mars' moons, a less difficult task probably than landing on Mars, one could have that human direct robots with very little time delay and greatly increase the effectiveness of robotic exploration. And correspondingly, as we've also observed, that that robotic explorers are very likely to visit new places in the universe well before humans are committed to such environs. There are, I believe, enormous opportunities for the unmanned space program to answer some of the most profound questions that exist in science. One that jumps to mind would be that to help us understand the character of that 23% of the universe's mass and 73% of its energy that we deem to be missing at this point in time. I'd like to dwell a little bit more extensively on the U.S. human spaceflight program because it was the primary subject of the review of which I participated last year. It also turns out to be the most controversial and costly aspect of U.S. space activities in most respects. Too often in the past, we've begun by asking what should be the human spaceflight program before we ask the why. And as you just heard previously, that asking the question why is turning out to be very difficult in many respects. The human spaceflight program in the past, I believe, and my team that I worked with believes will contribute enormously to humanity's storehouse of new capabilities that could be introduced into the commercial marketplace. It offers tangible benefits in fields ranging all the way from medicine to agriculture. It will add to humanity's store of scientific knowledge. But in the end, it was our conclusion that human spaceflight, given its cost, can't be justified solely, and I emphasize the word solely, on those benefits, even though they are real. But rather, it has to be justified on less tangible benefits, and that is where the effort becomes more difficult. The question is often raised, would we be better off to be investing in totally different things from the space program with the nation's treasury? But one of the things that we tried to point out is that there are very few fields that inspire young people to the extent that human spaceflight does. And many in my age group who are scientists and engineers in a lot of different fields today got their inspiration to go into that field because of their excitement over the early space program, particularly the human space program. And I found that nothing motivates young children to study science and math to the extent that two things, space and dinosaurs. At least at this point, we're short on dinosaurs. But it would be, I think, a terrible mistake to say that just because the justification of the human spaceflight program depends to a large degree on intangible benefits, to dismiss it as being unimportant. For example, who would dismiss the works of Beethoven or Shakespeare or Michelangelo as being irrelevant or without benefit? But that does bring us back to the point of economic cost of a human spaceflight program. There are those critics who argue, and I think in very good conscience, that we should spend our treasury on other important endeavors, perhaps trying to find a cure to cancer, then we should spend it on exploring the universe. I have to confess that as great as a space flight enthusiast as I am, were that the choice, I think I would vote in favor of let's try to find a cure for cancer. The problem is that's the wrong question, even though it's the question that is often asked. I think the correct question relates to the fact that in the United States we spend 9 cents per day per citizen to have a human spaceflight program. And the question is, if you take the least effective 9 cents per day per citizen that we spend in the entire U.S. federal budget, I think it becomes very easy to justify that we should have an aggressive human spaceflight program that costs perhaps twice that. Certainly $3 billion a year more, which is what our committee believes is necessary to have a continuing successful program. Others who embrace the idea of a space program, human space flight, or let me say space flight in general, will raise the question, why don't we let robots do it all? And I've been asked that many times by the press. My answer, first of all, I take note of the fact that one of our nation's leading lunar scientists has said that we learned more by having a trained geologist, Jack Schmidt, walk on the moon than we learned from all the robotic explorations that have been conducted to date. And the second answer I give to why humans comes back to intangibles. In the case when I was talking to a group from our media and was asked that question, I turned the question around and I said, who here knows the name of the first person to land on the moon? Well, everybody knew. And I said, what was the name of the first robot to land on the moon? Nobody knew. And I don't use that to say that there aren't important things to do with robots. There are. But the fact is there's a difference between, say, Sir Edmund Hillary landing on or climbing to the top of Mount Everest and lobbing a rocket to the top of Mount Everest with a flag in it. There's just a difference. And if one accepts that human spaceflight is justified, then the question, of course, comes up of what is it that we should be doing? What should we be exploring? And among our committee, the resounding answer to that was the planet Mars. There are many prominent engineers and scientists today who believe that we should go directly to Mars right now. Others believe that we should go back to the moon and establish a base there and get more familiar with space operations. Big problem, I think, there among many, but perhaps the most important one, again, is not a technical issue. Problem with going back to the moon, which we were saying was going to take another 20 years, cost many billions of dollars, is that if you talk to young people, they say, well, we've been there, we've done that. That was my grandfather's space program. So if we're to inspire people, it was our belief that Mars has to be the objective. The problem with going to Mars is that we're not prepared to do it, either technically or economically. There are still some unknowns, some major unknowns, one of which is the effect of galactic cosmic rays on the human body. And while it takes 2 or 3 days to return from the moon, if you encounter a problem, a normal Mars mission might require 6 months or so. So it's a bit of a different challenge. Our committee offered what we call a flexible path, where you would take various steps, and you didn't wait for 20 years to have a big event, but you had a number of events every few years. And that pattern of events might include things like docking with a asteroid, or going to then go to a Lagrangian point, and then perhaps circumnavigate Mars, perhaps go into orbit around Mars, and land on either Phobos or Deimos, moons of Mars, and then land on Mars ultimately itself. In order to make this practicable, it was our belief that one thing we should do is to establish a logistics base in near-Earth orbit, where one could do assembly, which we're getting pretty good at, and where one could do refueling, which Werner von Braun pointed out was a very important element of distant space travel. And hauling fuel components into near-Earth orbit could be the basis of a very strong commercial space business. And in the early days in the U.S., when our airlines were struggling, they were given contracts by the U.S. government to haul mail. And that's what really turned the corner for airlines in the U.S. And I think contracts to haul fuel, for example, could have that same impact in the commercial arena of space. One of the more promising features, exciting features of a Mars program is that it indeed could be conducted as an international cooperative endeavor involving many nations of all sizes from around the globe. And there are a lot of nations in a position to contribute to such an undertaking. Furthermore, the existing International Space Station management structure has worked extremely well and could form a very strong basis for whatever is the next step into space by using it as a core to add other participants. So that's a brief view of the past, present, and future of space activity, at least in the U.S. as I see it. And it's probably useful at this point to recall that it's fairly traditional that when we look at the future, we overestimate the near term and we underestimate the long term. And assuming that that might be the case here, I'd like to talk a little bit about, as I close, what might be some of the things in the longer term that we're underestimating at this time. And the first item on my list would be space tourism. And I don't refer to brief suborbital flights to relatively high altitudes. I'm talking about 2 or 3 day journeys into space, into orbit, where passengers, tourists, could take photographs, out of this world photographs, I might say, where they could experience weightlessness if they want to do that. I think a lot of people do for some reason. Where they can attend lectures, where they can look through telescopes, and so on. The problem, of course, is that space travel is very costly. But just like with airline travel, I believe the only thing that could reduce the cost of space travel markedly is to increase the volume markedly. And the only thing that could increase the volume to that extent, in my mind, is space tourism. And if we can bring it about, we can reduce the cost, make it accessible to more people. We also have to make it much safer. When I'm challenged as to, is this a reasonable hope, I like to point out that what's it been, 108 years ago, the Wright brothers flew it. If you ask the Wright brothers, do you suppose that 108 years from now, 3 times the population of Tel Aviv will get on an aircraft in the U.S. alone and fly and complain because they'd already seen the movie and the food's bad? Highly unlikely. Or you might have asked Sir Edmund Hillary, what's the likelihood that half a century from now 42 people will stand on the top of Everest one morning? I suspect he would have doubted it himself. Or Amundsen and Scott, you ask what's the likelihood 15,000 people will go to Antarctica every year? I would rather suspect they would have questioned that. So I build my confidence in the human space flight for the purpose of tourism based on that kind of progress. Beyond that, though, of course, there are the really mind-bending possibilities. One of those that's embraced by a few serious scholars is that we need to begin populating other planets in the event that we destroy our own planet or that we're destroyed by a large asteroid. And that, of course, brings the possibility that we could divert a large asteroid that might be headed toward the Earth one day and save us save the human race. The one problem with that, on the other hand, it's probably a good thing the dinosaurs didn't think of that because they probably would have eaten us and we wouldn't be here. So finally, there's that penultimate possibility, and that is that somewhere on all these planets circling the 10 to the 11th suns in our universe, in our galaxy alone, the statistics just seem to be overwhelming that maybe there's somebody out there. And if they are, they may not be decades ahead of us. They may be millennia ahead of us in terms of their technological and social development. And just think of the consequences of that. And that brings us back to the beginning of the presentation where we were talking about the Earth being created 4.5 billion years ago. So at this point, let me thank you once again for this opportunity to share some thoughts on the U.S. space program. I'm an optimist for the future, and my closing challenge would be to match budgets and objectives, even if it means reducing objectives, because at least we will accomplish something, I think, worthwhile. My hope is that we will be able to strongly fund the program. And I think also that as we look to the future, if there was ever a time that those of us on the surface of this planet could use the kind of inspiration that was provided by Yuri Gagarin, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Ilan Ramon, this is that time. Thank you very much.
תודה רבה רבה לנורמן אגוסטין. עכשיו יש לנו את ההרצאות של נאסא, של האסטרונאוטית ברברה מורגן והמדען ג'ייקוב כהן, ואני אבקש מחווה שכטר, דירקטורית אצלנו במכון וגם דירקטורית בתעשייה אווירית, להציג את המרצים הנכבדים הבאים שלנו. חווה.
להציג את ברברה מורגן זה פשוט כבוד. ברברה היא אסטרונאוטית אשר השתתפה בטיסת החלל STS 118 ב-2007. ברברה השתתפה בטיסה הזו כמישן ספיישליסט. ממש אסטרונאוטית עם כל המשימות הטכניות המשמעותיות, כפי שהתבטא מייקל גריפין, שכל כך הרבה דובר עליו כאן, והמנהיגות שלו בתחום החלל בהרצאה של דוקטור נויפלד. ברברה במקצועה היא מורה. היא למדה בסטנפורד, קיבלה תואר ראשון בסטנפורד ביומן ביולוגי, ותואר בתעודת הוראה כבר בשנת 74 מהנוטרדם יוניברסיטי קולג', ואחר כך בשנת 85 נבחרה להיות אסטרונאוטית, כשאז היא נבחרה להיות מחליפה של קריסטינה מקוליף שנספתה אחר כך בחללית הצ'לנג'ר. 12 שנה אחר כך ברברה נבחרה להיות, כפי שאמרנו, אסטרונאוטית במלוא מובן המילה. עשתה קורס של 2 עשתה את כל המשימות, הוסמכה וביצעה משימות בטיסת החלל ב-2007. ב-2008 ברברה סיימה את תקופת השירות שלה בנאסא והחליטה להקדיש את מרצה ויכולותיה להוראה ולחינוך. כיום היא במינוי כפול בשני חוגים בבואזי סטייט יוניברסיטי באיידאו. רק אישיות כמו שלה יכולה לבצע מינוי כפול בהנדסה ובחינוך. להבין את האישיות של ברברה אפשר להבין דרך ציטוט שהיא אומרת: כל אחד יכול להגשים את חלומותיו, השמיים אינם הגבול. מילותיה אלה של ברברה מורגן נחקקו לצד ציטוטי דבריהם של ניל ארמסטרונג, ג'ון קנדי ואחרים. יש כאן כל כך הרבה בני נוער, כל כך הרבה תלמידים, כל כך הרבה שהיו תלמידים ותמיד רוצים ללמוד. האמירה הזאת מדברת בעד עצמה. ציטוט נוסף של ברברה נאמר באמירה שלה שהיא כל כך גאה להשתתף במאמץ שעושה אותנו כולנו קצת מקודמים על ידי חקר החלל. אנחנו גאים לקבל את ברברה ולהקשיב לה. פליז, ברברה מורגן.
Since I'm a teacher and I know you've been sitting a long time and we've got some equipment to set up, would you like to stand up and stretch? Please do. You have time. Okay, break us up. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I truly want to thank our distinguished hosts and everybody for holding this very, very important conference that really brings us all together. And I also want to say as we get started, that Ilan Ramon and his family are very, very important to me. Maybe we could turn down some lights. These pictures show up a lot better. Where did we come from? What are we made of? Why are we here? Where are we going? Those are four of the best and the biggest questions ever asked. And they are also great examples of the best teaching tool ever used by teachers. Questions. And space is an enormous, beautiful, elegant, dynamic arena for those big questions, and for many others. Teachers approach these questions by using many techniques. They engage their students through hands-on physical activities to make learning as real as possible, like here in Israel with FIRST Robotics and with the CubeSat project that I just saw earlier this afternoon at the Science Center in Herzliya. Teachers also use logic, science, and story. Logic uses reason. Logic asks, if this is so, then what else is so? Science asks questions whose answers can be tested. Science asks questions through experimentation and observation. And story? The story is a shared experience. The listener or the reader empathizes with the story's heroes and deeply learns from their experiences. So then, big questions and logic, science, and story. I'm sure all of you can think of ways that space exploration helps us ask those big questions, and Norm Augustine helped us very much just a few minutes ago with that. And so I'd like to share a few moments from this teacher's life to give a sense of how space can be used in the classroom. Before I became an astronaut, I taught school in the northern Rocky Mountains in an isolated little town on a beautiful blue lake. One day, we all woke up to read this newspaper headline. It said, "Scientist says it's like seeing the face of God." In Idaho and in Israel, that's a very catchy headline. That story was about NASA's COBE satellite, the Cosmic Background Explorer. It was giving us our best look yet at the creation of the universe, a glimpse at the very beginnings of time. The discovery of faint, wispy remnants of the so-called Big Bang, although predicted, was so astounding that it was almost disturbing. And in ways, it was an astrophysical equivalent of finding the Garden of Eden. And the people in Idaho shared with the scientist his wonder and awe. People were engaged by that picture of COBE that COBE sent back to us. It was a picture of the early universe. It was like a map of everything, colored in pinks and blues. Well, I showed this picture to my students, and I told them about the scientist's comments. And I asked them a big question. I asked, what was it like to them? And one of them jumped up and he said, "It's really exciting. It makes your bones shake just to think about it." Well, it did make my students' bones shake, and it made their eyes go wide, and it made their brains start working. It made them think about it and talk about it, about size and distance and scale. And they thought not just about where we came from, but where we are. By sharing experiences like COBE and the Hubble Space Telescope and the construction of our International Space Station, children have the same kinds of questions that Einstein had about time and space. They don't just say, wow, they ask why, and they ask how. Somebody asked me what it was like for me to see that colorful image of COBE sent back. And for me, it was like looking into the eyes of my students. It was like coming face to face with the mystery of human understanding and with how children build their concepts of the world. It was how they learn best, through curiosity and wonder. Well, here's another classroom story of wonder. And this one comes from when I was teaching third grade. My students were 8 and 9 years old. My students' imaginations had no limit. But it was interesting to me that their interests had some limits. For example, my young students loved to be challenged, but they did not like being frightened. And I learned that while we adults may be spurred into action by necessity and danger, children, especially young ones, are apt to become subdued. And when my third graders were learning about global climate change, they were visibly concerned. Sure, they wanted to save our Earth, but the negative prospects bothered them. And they did not want to be interested because they were scared. But then I shared with them a story about a NASA ER-2 science aircraft. It was flying high to check the ozone levels over Norway. And then the lights in my students' eyes flashed back on. High flight, the Arctic, the Northern Lights. They started asking big questions. What is it like? They asked me. Is it cold? Is it dark all the time? My students were hooked. They liked the idea that they could fly high in airplanes to help save the world. Well, I joined the Astronaut Corps in 1998, and I launched in 2007 on a construction mission to our International Space Station. I learned a lot in space, and I realized much more. For example, on Earth, there are 3 things people can stare at forever: a campfire, the ocean, the sky. And in space, there are 2 things that you want to stare at forever. One is space itself, the indescribable blackness that looks nothing like the blackness here on Earth. And the other one is our Earth. On our mission, we were so busy working that we literally had to steal moments to look down at our Earth. But when we did look down or up, the view was absorbing. The Earth, it's a planet. It's round. It glows. The oceans are immense. And in fact, our commander, Scott Kelly, said, I don't know why we call our planet Earth. We really ought to call it ocean. The landforms are fascinating too. So many different yellows and reds, the folded mountain chains, the convoluted rivers, and the continents. Australia looks like another planet from space. It looks like Mars all by itself. Whole weather systems too. When you're on the dark side of the Earth, you watch huge families of thunderstorms stretching for hundreds of miles. And these are what we call isolated thunderstorms, stretching all across the Indian Ocean. The lightning flashes, and every other thundercloud across the ocean lets loose its lightning. Every lightning bolt triggers another lightning bolt clear across the ocean. There's no such thing as isolated thunderstorms, by the way. One way that I stole moments to watch the Earth was by volunteering to put the shade on our middeck window to keep the sunlight out during our sleep periods. I like to float in front of that window and soak in the view. Once I looked out upon our space station's huge solar arrays. We were on the dark side of the Earth, so the arrays were in shadow and you could see their shape against the stars. Suddenly, in the distance, a thin blue arc appeared. It was the Earth's horizon. And then this blue arc grew, and another one rose under it, and another one, into many, many layers of blue, each one a different hue. And I'm not sure we have that many vocabulary words for the color blue, at least in the English language. I just want to stop for a minute and let you know, in this picture, I think you can see maybe 3 or 4 or 5 layers. If you were actually in space with me, you'd be seeing about 15 to 20 layers. Then the sun hit the solar arrays, and the arrays began to glow. They became a brilliant Inca gold against the black of space. And they truly looked like golden sails. We were sailing over an enormous ocean in quiet, no sound but the low humming of our fans. And then it was daylight, and I looked down at a bright blue ocean. I thought back 500 years to the earlier ages of discovery, and I thought about how hard it must have been for those sailors. And here we were, sailing so smoothly along. And then suddenly above the horizon, I saw the crescent moon, and it really seemed like we could just yank on the tiller, take a sharp right turn, and just sail on over. And that's when it truly hit me that spaceflight is a very natural thing for human beings to do. So there is that big question, where are we going? Every space mission, human or robotic, offers many opportunities for rich education activities. One of our NASA activities on board the International Space Station was to help our students think about a big question. And this particular question was, how will humans survive on future long-duration space missions? Specifically, can they grow their own food to sustain themselves? So we challenged students to design plant growth chambers. It was up to the students to decide whether their designs were for chambers to be used on Mars, or on the moon, or in deep space, or even in their own backyard. More than 2 million students accepted our challenge, and they designed plant growth chambers, and they built them. And my shuttle crewmates and I took up with us a small plant growth chamber and 10 million basil seeds. And yes, basil seeds are really small. In this package, we've got 1 million. We left the growth chamber and some of those seeds on board Space Station for the station crew to grow and observe the plants for later comparison. But we brought most of those seeds back to Earth with us. And 2 million students got to experiment with them in their own plant growth chambers to observe how they grew after a long voyage into space. And I want to say this again. Every space mission, human or robotic, offers many opportunities for education projects and many ways to motivate students. Well, I have one more story. Remember how stories are shared experiences of human life? Well, good stories give us good role models to follow, even when the stories are sad or tragic. And I'm not just talking about role models for children. We adults need role models too. On February 1st, 2003, on the morning the Space Shuttle Columbia's scheduled return from orbit, I happened to be flying above Cape Canaveral, Florida, in a shuttle training jet aircraft. I was with the chief of the astronauts, Kent Rominger, and we were performing approaches and landings. We checked the winds and the weather and the other conditions, and we radioed those findings to help Columbia land. Then we watched out our window for Columbia to appear. A space shuttle's return from orbit is so precise that you know almost exactly when to expect a sighting. We watched out our window, and it was the eeriest moment of my life. We watched, Columbia did not appear. It's a sad story, a tragic story, but even through tragedy, we learn. As Aristotle said, tragedy is about great people attempting great things. And among other lessons, we learn from true tragedies that great things are worth doing, and that our heroes, our role models, are the best of teachers, and they help us ask the big questions. And those questions are like, why are we here, and where are we going? Thank you, everyone.
המרצה הבא, אנחנו מקדמים בברכה את דוקטור ג'ייקוב כהן, שמכהן כיום בתפקיד מדען ראשי במשרד להפקת תועלת שימושית מחקר החלל. בנוסף הוא מכהן בתפקידים נוספים משנה למנכ"ל חטיבת התכנון והמנהל של איימס ביולוגי במסגרת מנהל ההנדסה במרכז המחקר איימס של נאס"א. דוקטור כהן אחראי לפיתוח מטרות קצרות וארוכות טווח, השגת מימון וכוח אדם ויישום של הזדמנויות מבוססות ביולוגיה. בין היתר הוא מתעניין בנושאים של רכבי חלל קטנים ומוביל שיתופי פעולה במחקר בתחום הזה. מעיון בחומרים שפורסמו בקשר לפעילותו המגוונת עובר כחוט השני המוטו של מחקר יישומי שמטרתו לתרום לקדמה המסחרית והחינוכית של האנושות תוך ניצול יעיל של היקשי המחקר בחלל. פליז, דוקטור כהן.
So, shalom, and thank you very much for giving me actually the honor of speaking in the Ilan Ramon conference. This is a conference that's actually very dear to me and the NASA family. Besides that, it's actually a great honor to be able to speak to the future generation, the generation that's actually going to push the envelope further for space exploration, and in particular human space exploration. And of course, lastly, I will honor, and I'm really honored to be speaking in a panel or a conference that has such distinguished guests, and of course, following an astronaut, which is what I always wanted to be as a kid. So it's always fun to be in that great company and seeing it. Now, if you can see on the title, I'm going to be speaking about space biology. And I think that's an important topic. And, you know, the first thing you think about is how are they connected? Well, the previous speakers have hinted to some of the areas of where space biology is. And I will at least try to give you some of the stuff that NASA is working on and also some of the vision that I would like to put forward for space biology. So STS-107, like a lot of missions, was mainly geared toward research, scientific research in both the physical and life sciences, in technology development, in the areas of commercial and also international research. Its focus was to do research, and the astronauts that fly, the teams that put together the flight opportunities spend their lives, dedicate their lives to perform this research. So this research is really critical. And I will share some of the areas here of the research and also talk about some potential gains from it. Most importantly, what you see in the background here is a list of all of the investigations that were on STS-107. Most of the experiments were actually biology-based. They were either fundamental in nature, they were either based on human exploration and astronaut extension of life and behavior on space and the ISS, and some biotechnology payloads. So we heard a lot about space exploration. And I think what's really important is to understand that space exploration is like any other exploration that we have. It's in our genetics. And my background is as a biologist, so I will use a lot of biology terms as we go forward with this. We always dream about exploring other areas. This is how come we made it to United States in its invention. This is where we go to the extremes on Earth, and we will go and conquer the extremes of space. Now, this particular slide covers the beginnings. And I have a picture here that says Moon Landscape. And this is an artwork that Ilan Ramon actually took up with him. And the key point here is that even at the worst times of humanity, the worst times that you could think of, people, children, think of exploring space. In particular, this is the landscape as being seen by Peter Gens and looking at what its Earth will look like from space. We also heard in previous talks about the vision of space exploration and seeing it in fiction as a space station and a shuttle. Well, my vision for the space station and the shuttle came from when I saw a 007 movie, Moonraker. That gives you about the age that I got really interested in space, and that drove me to be interested in rockets and all that area. We then conquered space in terms of living by having the first dog fly in space, and I will actually argue that probably Sputnik had some microbes on it that flew, so they were the first organisms from Earth that flew there. Followed by man, and of course at the end you see the loop of seeing man on the moon. So space biology. You could break any science into a lot of different fields, a lot of different structures. Currently in NASA, you could break it up into these 4 categories that are connected. You have astrobiology, which is looking at life in other planets, the extent of life in the universe. You have an area called fundamental space biology, different terms like that, and it's looking at the foundation of biology that is taken from Earth to space. The ultimate goal, of course, is to do human research and human exploration. And so we need to apply those. And we apply those and those lessons to be able to create the life support and the needed tools to do further exploration. Now on the bottom you see that it says these statements that are really circular in a way. But they're true. Knowledge leads to application. When you reach the application, you have new goals, and that develops your new knowledge. When people ask, why do we do space exploration, and they try to find a reason X and Y, in reality, we explore it to advance humanity, to advance the knowledge in all areas, whether it's down on Earth here, to explore space, or if anything was to happen to this planet, that we would be able to survive somewhere else. It is critical to remember that, because that's what drives us forward. It doesn't drive us forward to just continuously build the same wheel that is pulled by a horse. So I'll start with astrobiology. So astrobiology, in its basics, looks for the origins, the understanding of life, its distribution across the universe, and where life will go in the future. And the question that you may ask is, why are we asking this now? I mean, it would seem, so abstract to a certain area. We know that early on people have done studies that looked at Earth evolution of life, chemical evolution. But why ask this question now? Well, timing is really important. And what we do know right now is that we're capable of doing both manned, but more importantly, robotic missions to really extreme environments at this point. We are also doing a lot of studies of looking at Earth-like planets that potentially are out there in a zone called the habitable zone, which basically means you're looking for a planet that's in a distance from a sun that will have a certain temperature in areas like that, and we have certain materials that will give you potential for life, and at least life as we know it and how it works. We also know that once life begins, it goes everywhere. Almost. There are some physical and chemical rules that prevent certain areas for it, at least for now, to be conquered. But in general, when we look at our own planet, almost everywhere you look, you find life. It adapts, it changes to meet those areas. And of course, lastly, my favorite tool, since I studied molecular evolution and apply molecular, is by understanding the evolution and the models that exist there, we know that we could always expand further. So let's look at our solar system in terms of astrobiology, but I'll probably diverge a little bit to what it tells us about Earth also. Well, usually when you want to know how things turn out, whether it's in families or plants, you look at your next door neighbors. So Earth has at least two neighbors besides the moon, and that is Venus and Mars. And these two planets are really critical and important for us both to understand what could happen or what could have happened to ourselves here on this planet, but they also have a lot of the information and the materials that is needed for life. So, was life created there? Is life on there? Well, Venus has real extreme environments. As you can see, it's close to the sun. It has high temperatures, pressures, but there are some people that say that in the atmosphere there's still a habitable zone. Somehow, mankind has always been drawn to Mars. I believe that actually science fiction drives a lot of our science and the development. And in Mars, we first thought there might be little green creatures walking around. Then we decided there's nothing there. And as we literally dug further and further into Mars, we realized that it has the components for life. Does life exist? Did life exist below it? It's a study that's yet to behold. Now, there are other areas that we could look in our area, in our immediate family within the solar system. And there are moons, and you could look at moons like Europa, which most people have heard, which have a lot of water on them, ice, potential water underneath. And why is water so important? Well, besides the carbon that we are built of, the other thing that we mostly require is water. And so if we assume that life in other planets would be similar to ours, or at least life in our solar system will be similar to ours, then water would be critical. So understanding whether water is there is an important point. But this was discussed in a previous talk, which is really critical. What we're looking at right now on one of the missions called Kepler, we're looking at this span. And in this span, where you see the sun there, we're trying to determine if there are planets that are rotating around the sun, and are those planets in a habitable zone area. Now, even if statistically we found no planets, which I could tell you that's not true, but if we didn't even, we're just looking at our galaxy in this picture. Look at the size of the galaxy and then imagine many, many more galaxies around. And this only is under the assumption that life on other planets is based on the way we have our life. So astrobiology is pushing to understand those limits and how do we apply those to understand whether there's life in other areas. So I'll move to the next stage, which is fundamental space biology. And the amazing thing about biology is that you could get insight onto the biological systems by changing the environment that they're in. This is how we identify a lot of the genetic diseases or other materials in our systems that change and give us the ability to have a thought of how to combat back these diseases. Space, and this is actually an interesting story in a way, because as I studied evolutionary biology and flew rockets when I was in 4th, 5th grade, when you get to graduate school, you concentrate, and I concentrated on biology. And I actually didn't understand the full power of space for biology until after postdoctoral fellowship. And then I entered into the space arena. And what you could tell is if you change the environment, and space has a variety of changes, including microgravity, the lack of gravity, which we all were evolved to and developed under, it allows us to get insight. So this particular area of biology looks at the molecular and cellular levels that change or adapt in space, the whole lifespan of the organism, the interaction between organism, and life across the generations. And if we want to look at that in terms of applied, organisms provide small lifespan, short lifespan, that allow us to be able to magnify the effect of these environments on there. So fundamental space biology tends to use single cells, cell culture, things like fruit flies, and other organisms, plants, and lastly, vertebrates, as models to understand what are the effects of space. Now, variables, I talked about gravity, but there are lots of other variables that occur there. Radiation, temperature, substrate changes, the hypergravity of getting to space, and so on. And all of those play together. And so the effect that you see might not only be due to one of those variables, but could be for multiple variables. So let me go through a few examples. The first one is the effect of microgravity. Almost everything grows under gravity, and moss, like plants, if you look at their fruiting body and their plant itself, you will see that there's a gravitational response. On top, you see the effect on Earth, basically going opposite the force of gravity. And if you go and do the same thing in flight, taking away light and all of that, what you have is an organism that's growing in all directions. It has no sense of where to go. And of course, you repeat flights, you repeat experiments to make sure that they're correct. And what you see here is a repeat that was done on STS-107. Ilan Ramon's flight. This is the actual sample. It survived, it was fixed, it survived and was recovered. The point here is that this plant gives us a glimpse. We all, when we get up, walk and step on our feet. And we do that because we have the sensation of gravity and up and down. Second, what happens to microbes when you go to space? Well, it's interesting because in most cases, nothing when you're looking at the crew. But if you take a culture of certain bacteria or fungi and grow them in a standing culture, not mixing them, and in a rich media that provides lots of food, and then you bring them down to Earth and introduce them to a host, like a mouse, you will actually see that in the immediate response after flight, more mice die as returned from flight than your control on the ground. Now, this is transient. It has been repeated, as you could see in multiple flights and by at least 2 different PIs. And we also know that if you change the media, you don't see this effect. So this in particular, this experiment has spun off trying to understand to create better vaccines to study from this. There are other commercial entities. The one thing that you see from flight is when you take off gravity from humans and from animals, well, you get instant bone loss. On Earth it occurs and it's called osteoporosis. You get muscle loss. You get immune deficiency. And so there are companies that test drugs on orbit to augment their studies that they do on the ground here to counter that. At the end, we all try to understand humans and what is needed for flight. And so the human research program itself tries to look at the top risks, tries to find how we counter them. Also, being able to develop the medical and technical capabilities to do analysis and diagnosis in wherever you go, whether it's Mars 6 months away or so on. If you have an emergency, you can't wait to return back here. And we need to be able to validate these technologies. So we use the ISS, the International Space Station, and you saw beautiful pictures of the space station. to test them, to test our exercise regime, the nutrients requirements. How do we diagnose? How do we get an astronaut to self-diagnose? We do that as a test. It allows us to then expand and do space exploration in a safe manner. Lastly, if you remember the chart that had those wheels combined, I had life support. Well, you couldn't do any of these experiments, any of these studies, without being able to support life. And this is a nice equation when we think about going to Mars, asteroid, the moon for a long time. I will draw just the conclusion on the bottom that says we need about 11.3 metric tons per person per year are the requirements of breakdown for a crew member. In the normal area of just doing fuel, just taking the normal hardware up to space, this is very costly for us to do space exploration. It might even prevent us from doing space exploration. Of course, as a biologist, always has an answer, and typically as a biologist, it's a biological answer. But let's look and study about our own planet. If we want to close the loop on this life support, which everyone is trying to do, if you look at Earth, and this is a nice drawing, you can see if we have the astronaut and we have needs and the cycle across it, well, that question mark, I think most of you could answer of what is done on Earth that actually does that. And that typically is our ecosystem, the plants, the microbes, the whole cycle that we're part of. So now I'm going to move into an area that's new, that I think is going to change the way we look at biology and is going to change the way space exploration is done in the future. And that area currently is called synthetic biology. I think the terminology is not as important as what is the concept. And the concept here is not to study biology and to understand biology to solve more biological questions. It's to turn biology around. One of the most difficult things for biologists to do when they come to work for NASA is to be able to understand the language of the engineers that are all over the place. Well, this turns around biology and uses biology as an engineering tool. It's taking all what we learned from genetic engineering, all that we learned from the different species, and trying to create things that are based on biology that will help us in the future, both on Earth and in space exploration. Now, why is biology the right tool? It's actually low mass. It's self-replicating. It's fast-growing, adaptable, flexible, and you could manufacture it. The key point here is that all biological systems need the same base to survive. We are able to take things, if you could imagine, a universal cell, and we could program it to do different things, to make medicines, the ability to create structural materials, and so on. So if you were to fly and do space exploration in such an approach, what you do is you take something that is dry, you take something that creates DNA, and you take the things that make it grow, and it will give you the products that you need. Do you need this product at this point? Use this organism for that. One vision could be to have bioreactors. These bioreactors could be used to produce food, to produce the oxygen that you need, to recycle the waste, to do drug development. And the beauty of this approach is, if one of your reactors go, you'll have other reactors, and they could actually grow all these different products that you need. Another thing that you could see all around us now, and in Israel is being done and researched in a lot of universities and commercial entities, is to actually produce energy. And there are multiple approaches for that. But that energy could be used for multiple purposes in space also. The last example, and there are many of these examples for this area, is as creating new materials that you need. And so you could imagine that one of the issues that we have is space radiation. And how do you deal with space radiation? Well, the thing that I learned in the lab is the first thing is stay away from it. Okay? But if we're going to do space exploration, we're not going to stay away from it. So the second is you need to make sure that you have the proper shielding. Now, shielding is heavy, is expensive to take from Earth to wherever you're going to go. Another way is to use the resources that are available to you on where you're going with a little help. You have turtles, you have other organisms that have shields themselves. And the beauty of those shields is that you could actually self-repair them. So if they get hit, they get damaged, you could make more of it. So you could program cells to create a lot of functions to them. Now, are we there yet? You hear that a lot in commercials in the States. This is something that is the push of the envelope to the next area. We have a lot of the technologies to do this, but we need to set the goals and the requirements for these types of approaches. So I'll give you a quote. And this quote came from Nature Biotechnology. And it states that at the turn of the last century, the Wright brothers achieved manned flights not by mimicking natural systems, but by applying the principles of engineering and aerodynamics. Some may argue about this. The second quote, part of this, it goes on to say, synthetic biology allows us to dispense with biological mimicry and design life forms uniquely tailored to our needs. I think that for me, biology is integrated into our future of space exploration because we will do man exploration, which is biology, and we will need to do the life support that is needed for it. One of the things that's really an honor, actually, for me here is to start bringing, for the Ilan Ramon Conference, more biology-based talks. And it is because of biology that we do space exploration. It is because of biology that we push the envelope forward. And with this, I would like to end and thank you for the pleasure of giving you a talk.
Would you like to answer?
Yes, that's why I did it. So, the beauty of technology is that I actually have a clock here that tells me the time. And I stopped a little early because I would like to answer any questions if anyone has questions. And either, if I don't get any questions, it either means that I did a terrible job on this talk or you're really not interested in it. So I'll put some peer pressure on you to ask at least one question. There are microphones on either side. I'm told they're going to work. Okay. Yeah, we'll get it.
I'm a student here in Israel, and I'd like to ask you about your job. Are you feeling that you fulfilled yourself in NASA as a scientist?
That's a great question, actually. And I actually gave a talk about it. I gave a talk this morning to some high school students. You know what drives me in life, and it's important? I usually give this example. When I was a kid, there was a commercial for a company on TV called Toys R Us. And that commercial said, "I don't want to grow up." And so as a scientist, I will tell you that I myself never want to grow up. And an agency like NASA, or any space agency, the Israeli Space Agency, or any of those areas, has endless opportunities to play with new toys. So I can tell you I'm very satisfied with my job. And I recommend that anyone that is here to highly think of going to not only as a requirement to college, but finishing a higher degree like a PhD or any other of the higher degrees that goes forward. It is a blast to be able to do this type of area. I could have $1 billion in a company, but this is a lot of fun. Who else, when I go back, could touch an experiment, load an experiment, and in STS-133 that's coming up, I'm going to fly the offsprings of the C. elegans that survived STS-107 back to space. I think, yes, it's a great job. Thank you.
מכובדיי, אני התבקשתי לעשות סיכום של הכנס ולא כתוב זמן לסיום, כך שתתכוננו. אלוף במילואים בודינגר נכנס כיושב ראש ומחליף אותי, ואני יושב ראש היוצא, מי שלא יודע, רון הרמון, מכובדיי כל האחרים. כשנתבקשתי להכין סיכום, אז חשבתי בהתחלה שזה הולך להיות סיכום על 12 שנים כאן כיושב ראש המכון. התחלתי לכתוב אחרי 14 עמודים שכתבתי על ההרתעה, על הגנה אקטיבית, על לייזרים, כל היתר. הבנתי שאני עוסק בתפיסת הביטחון, וזה לא בדיוק יהיה סיכום לכנס כזה. ולכן אני אצטרך להתרכז רק בנקודות שקשורות לכנס עצמו. הכנס קודם כל הוא מצוין, וזה מכל בחינה. רמת הנוכחים, איכות ההצגות, ואני מתכוון רמת הנוכחים גם הצעירים, לא רק המרצים. והתכנים כמובן מעל ומעבר. אני חושב שללא שום ספק הם מביאים הרבה כבוד, גם למדינת ישראל, גם למכון פישר וגם לשמו של אילן רמון. תודה לאסף אגמון, לטל ענבר, לשני ולכל האחרים בצוות על הביצוע. מגיע להם. אני אישית תמיד נהנה מאוד לראות את התמונות מתחנת החלל, מהשיגורים. זה נותן לך עולם שונה לגמרי לאחר שאתה בא בבוקר ושומע את החדשות בטלוויזיה. מאוד קשה לסכם כנס כזה. הרבה מאוד אינפורמציה, הרבה מאוד מחשבות. הזמן קצר מדי אפילו לנסח אותם נכון. אני אנסה לרכז כמה נקודות שהן לא חד משמעית מהכנס, אבל הן נובעות ממנו. נקודה ראשונה היא אישית. הכנס של שם אילן רמון הוא מאוד חשוב גם בעיניי אישית, כי אני מרגיש בהיותי מפקד חיל אוויר, כשמיינו את הצוות שהולך לקלוט את ה-F-16 החדשים בשנת 79, והביאו לה את המועמדים ודיברנו, בחרנו את מפקדי הטייסות, פחות או יותר החלטתי גם על סרן אילן רמון. בדיעבד אתה מבין שהחלטה אחת כזאת קבעה דרכו של אדם. ולכן אני מרגיש הרבה מחויבות גם למשפחה, גם לדרכו. הפעילות בחלל הביאה עד כה איכויות חיים הרבה מעבר למצופה. נראה לי שאיש לא העריך בעת ההחלטה על פרויקט חללי, על כל התפוקות שהתקבלו ממנו, בעת ההחלטה כמובן. ולכן זה איננו גישה כלכלית, זה לא cost effectiveness. אם מישהו יעריך את האפקט של ה-GPS כשהקימו את הפרויקט, או את האפקט של לווייני התקשורת למה שקורה היום, כמעט מעבר לכל אפשרות לצפות או לחזות על ידי מתכננים. המסקנה העיקרית, וזה לכם הצעירים, צריך להעיז ולהיכנס לפרויקטים, וזה יהיה למען שיפור איכות החיים של כולנו ושל כדור הארץ כולו. ב-1956, זה הרבה זמן מי שעושה חשבון, הייתי באנגליה וטסתי עם הרויאל איירפורס. לונדון הייתה אז עיר שהיית מגיע אליה בסוף שבוע מכוסה בסמג. למה? כי אז חיממו את כל הבתים עם פחם. והתוצר היה כזה שהחולצות שלנו תמיד היו שחורות אחרי שעה שהיינו בחוץ. היום בלונדון אפשר לשים מכלים או תחנות סולריות מסוימות בגלל שהדברים השתנו. הפאנלים הסולריים של הלוויינות היא זו שנתנה לאנושות את כל האפשרויות האלה. הקטנת התלות בנושא של דלק פחם היא אחד הדברים האסטרטגיים החשובים ביותר בעולם, וככל שנפתח את זה, יהיה לנו הרבה יותר טוב לאיכות החיים. והנושא הסולרי, החללי, הוא כזה שמכריח אותנו לעשות את הדברים הרבה יותר יעילים, הרבה יותר מוזערים והרבה יותר אפקטיביים. מנהל איסה של סוכנות החלל של אירופה סיפר על קושייו בקבלת החלטות בגלל מספר החברות הרב שיש לו באירופה. לפני כ-20 שנה אני השתתפתי בכנס חלל, ואז בישראל זה לא היה מקובל כל כך. מנכ"ל איסה של אז היה דוקטור לוסט, והוא חזר על אותה טענה. הוא אמר שיש לו 16 מדינות, וכל דיון יש לו 17 דעות. כשאני עליתי לדבר, אמרתי שאני אמנם מדינה אחת בארגון אחד, אבל אצלנו בכל דיון ישנם 17 דעות, ולפעמים הן משתנות בבוקר לאחרי הצהריים. עם זאת, התקציב של המדינה שלנו, שאיננו אירופאי בכל ממד, הכריח אותנו לחשוב ולעשות פרויקטים בחלל באמצעים הניתנים לנו לבצע. ולכן עשינו המון חשיבה, המון התלבטויות, והחלטות ללכת ללוויין קטן שכל העולם אומר שאין אפשר לעשות את זה, נאמר על ידי אשת ואחרים, הוא אחד האלמנטים האלה, והכורח הוא זה שהיה יותר חזק מהכל. כך שלא רק תקציב יש כאן לעשות, להעיז ולחשוב, ולהעיז ולחשוב ולעשות. החל מכנס החלל הראשון, אני מדבר על לוויינים on call, לפי קריאה. הסיפור שתמיד אני מספר זה ב-1981, יוני, שתקפנו את הכור, בבוקר קיבלתי הודעה שישנם סופות חול בדרך. ואני הייתי באותה התחושה שב-1980, באפריל, האמריקאים עשו מבצע לחילוץ בני הערובה שלהם באיראן, בטהרן, והם התנגשו עם המסוקים בגלל סופת החול שהייתה. היא כזאת שאתה לא יודע להעריך מה הנזק ומה האפשרות לעשות. הטייסים צריכים להמריא לקראת אחרי הצהריים. אין לי את האפשרות לוודא האם מזג האוויר יאפשר לעשות את הדבר כן או לא. משימה, מדרגה הכי גבוהה שיכולה להיות, סיכונים הכי גדולים, חוץ ממזג האוויר. ואני נותן את הדוגמה הזאת שאני אומר שאם היה באותו זמן אפשרות של לוויין און קול, לא משנה לי אם הרזולציה תהיה של 0.5 מטר, 20 סנטימטר או 2 מטר. אני משווה למצב האחר שישנו, ואני יכול להגיד אם המשימה אפשרית או לא, וזה לפעמים קריטי ברמה הכי אסטרטגית מדינית שיכולה להיות. אנחנו מדברים הרבה על לוויינים קטנים, ואני חושב שהדבר הזה כבר נכנס לתודעה ולמודעות. לא מספיק לוויינים קטנים ומיקרו. צריך לוויינים on call. הצורך של זה הוא גם צורך אזרחי. כשיש לך רעידת אדמה במקום מסוים, שיש לך אסונות טבע אחרים, אם אתה יכול להביא את האינפורמציה הכי מהר, גם העזרה תינתן ותציל הרבה אנשים. לכן הוא צורך אמיתי לכל דבר, ואיננו צריך להיות דווקא מהאיכות הכי גבוהה שישנה בעולם. אני מברך מאוד על תוכנית החלל הלאומית שהוגשה לממשלה. ואני מברך עוד יותר על ההירתמות של שר החינוך לכיוון הטכנולוגי, שייתן לנו את האפשרות לקדם את נושא החלל. אני מקווה מאוד שהתוכניות האלה אכן ימומשו, כי מתוך ניסיוני בעבר לא מספיק להגיש תוכניות. יש להילחם יום יום על המימוש. בהיותי מעורב בכל השלבים הראשונים של תוכנית החלל, מ-1979 לא 1980, זה הסכם השלום מצרים שאז התחלנו בנושא הלוויינות. במשך 20 שנה עסקתי בזה, וזה היה מלחמה יומיומית על התקציב. אפילו את הסלוט ללוויין האזרחי של עמוס, מה שנקרא, עם מאיר עמית ישבנו והקצינו לזה כסף כדי לשמור את אותו סלוט, למרות שלא יכולנו עדיין להרים לוויין. לפיכך אני מסיים את תפקידי במכון פישר, אחרי שהקמתי אותו לפני 12 שנה, ולא לבד עשיתי אותו כמובן, עם סיפוק רב. אני מאמין שמכון פישר תרם כממריץ מרכזי בכל נושא קידום נושא החלל בישראל, וכנס זה הוכחה לכך. תודה רבה על כנס מצוין.